and welcome to EnergyTech Essentials from the Net Zero Technology Centre. This is a series of interesting webinars, events, where we're pulling upon our fantastic partners that we work with at the Net Zero Technology Centre's TechX programme to explore some of the key topics that come up when you're building an energy tech startup. Everything from raising investment, to trying to find funding, to building the technology. And today's one, we are focusing all around grant writing. One of the most common ways that energy tech startups fund that journey is through finding grant opportunities. And we're joined today by Jonathan from Ayming, who's one of our partners, who is hopefully going to give us an interesting insight into grant writing. How are you today, Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm very well, thanks. Yeah, how are you doing, Ed?
Good, thank you. Really appreciate your time. If anyone is watching along live, feel free to pop a question in the Q&A function to the side. But if not, we're going to go through lots of different themes today. But maybe to kick us off, Jonathan, I'm going to hand over to you to just give us an introduction to who you are and what Ayming does, and an opening first question. What are some of the top 5 most common red flags that you see when companies approach grant writing that maybe negatively affects their chance to get a grant?
Brilliant. Great. Thanks, Ed. So I'm Jonathan. I lead the grants practice for Ayming. So I lead a team here who work solely on putting together grant applications for businesses around the UK. So we spend a lot of time thinking about grants, helping clients present their stories. So we certainly, over a year, do get a chance to work on lots of different projects and certainly think about some red flags that do come up. Sometimes businesses that we work with have already put together some grant applications themselves, and there is definitely some kind of common themes that we come across when we start working with a client. So one of the main things to highlight in terms of red flags is just taking a back. So a new founder may often come from a technical background and will be immersed in their technology, in their business, and particularly when you're fairly early in the R&D life cycle, it can feel like quite easy just to get a little bit so immersed in the technical work that you're doing. When you're telling your story for a grant application, you really need to make an assessor sit up and really quickly care about what it is that you're presenting. And often these grants get looked at by 3, 4, or 5 different people, sometimes not particularly technical experts in your area. So one of the main things we recommend and we say when we look at these applications is just think about that story that you're telling. How do you narrate what you're doing in a way that an average person on the street will care about in some way? So think about the broader link, the link to someone's life or impact that it might have on someone who's maybe not familiar with your technical area. That's quite a big one and really one to think about, I think. So some other red flags, showing rather than telling. This is more about how you write, how you put together your application. And it's quite easy to make a claim about something, to say we're the first to explore this area, or we're we've got the most significant results. But really to convince an assessor, it's going to need to be shown. So it's all often about quantifying claims you're making, really making sure your application is rich with data, is a really good way of showing rather than telling. Another one that comes up quite a lot is thinking about your plan to sell and your route to market. So we've been working with a kind of hardware-based clean energy company recently, who had really focused a lot on the kind of technical R&D work that they were doing, And there were some really substantial technical challenges to overcome before they could even really think about engaging too closely on selling to customers. And so with them, it was really important to actually start even thinking about price points, start thinking about the numbers of customers they would like to reach once that R&D is complete. And hopefully that's part of the business planning anyway. But even if it's maybe not if you're quite an early stage, for a grant application, it's really helpful even just to jot down some very initial numbers so that you can start quantifying where you would like to be in 5 years' time and give assessors a sense of the ambition of what you're after. Then another area, which is maybe something that I don't know if I would have said a couple of years ago, but has certainly become on the agenda in applications that I saw last year. And to be honest, these days is now kind of pretty standard, is of course AI. So obviously a big hot topic. So in terms of AI and writing, I think it's very easy to put your ideas into a kind of an AI program, and we tend to find that it gives fairly kind of generic, quite unspecific type of text, which on the surface kind of looks good, but actually when you read it, it lacks that kind of precision that's needed. So there's lots of different ways of using AI, but we certainly don't recommend using it for your drafts of grant applications. And if you do submit something, it will be kind of acceptable, but it really don't think it will convince an assessor. So be very, very cautious in terms of how you're using AI when you're putting together your grant applications. Can be really appealing to do given how extensive these are, but we found definitely we can quite quickly see when that's being used. Final red flag, which is it kind of varies a little bit depending on who we're working with and almost like the personality of the founder and their kind of skills and what they're comfortable with. But a general theme is thinking about what are you actually going to do on the project. Mm-hmm. So this is something that goes back all the way to when I was working in universities and supporting academics to win research funding for their projects. And we found that often it's quite easy to get caught up in the kind of the big problem, the ideas, the motivation for the project. And quite a lot of the time, it can be easy to kind of dodge those really specific details about what activities you're going to conduct, when, who's going to do them, what are your milestones. So that's something that, you know, some founders really like that, and they might have that kind of background in thinking about R&D projects or project management. But for some founders, that's definitely a weaker area. So we would definitely suggest that if you think that might be you, just start with that. So start with putting together a Gantt chart, drafting some work packages, and use that really as a way of opening up a conversation with partners that you might be bringing onto the project, and just thinking, what are we actually going to do? How long is this project going to be? 12, 18 months? How are we going to use our time? Who's going to lead on which areas? And that's a great place to start because it means that you're going to have a really tangible sense of activities and objectives on the project, which is a great place to start when you're writing. And it's also a really great place to start when you're thinking about your costings as well. So once you know what you're going to do, you can really get that costings process in terms of allocating time and costs and materials to people, which can take a bit of time. So if you start there, then you've given yourselves almost that kind of critical path to get everything in on time.
Brilliant. Yeah, I can reflect on quite a lot of those I've seen, particularly similar in the past few years. That AI challenge has come up a little bit more, and the technical specification as well. There's always this balance, and maybe that's an interesting opening question. In that, one of the things we often see with energy tech founders, especially the ones that are technical, is they want to go into a lot of technical detail, but equally they have this challenge around intellectual property and how much can I share. So again, how is that handled? So that was one of your points, is trying to make the technology clear, But then also, how do you find that line between then also needing to make sure you're protecting your intellectual property?
Yeah, yeah. So I think I think the key thing that assessors are going to be interested in with technical detail is going to be a kind of a nice summary of where that area is, what's already done in that area, the kind of gold standard, and then being super clear and precise about which are the areas where your technology is going to differ and going to surpass that. So it's quite easy to write a lot and go into loads of detail, but that's kind of a good way of focusing what you need to write, is just looking at the kind of the specific areas that you're going to surpass. Now, obviously, as you said, that does open up. Those are always also going to be the areas which are going to potentially be a bit sensitive for IP. I think generally it's not something of too much concern. So, if we're talking about Innovate UK, for example, your application will go to between 3 and 5 assessors. They have to sign quite strict codes of conduct about information that they can share. And I think also, so you're protected in that way. In terms of publicly shared material, you get to usually draft a couple of key summaries where you can quite easily avoid going into too much detail, and that's the bit that's shared publicly. So I think one way or another, I think it's really important to be specific and precise, and I wouldn't let that concern about IP mean that it can kind of drift into kind of generalizations, which I think is probably, I think, a much bigger risk that ultimately the project doesn't get funded for that reason.
Very valid point there. So let's imagine we often work with energy technology startups, which I know you've met several of them through the program. So let's take it back to finding these grant opportunities. Often they are maybe R&D projects, they're still in universities, they're still in labs, so they're that prime time for trying to find funding opportunities for their research. So what is the best way to start? There's so many different grant opportunities. There's the UK, there's European, there's maybe international grants. What would you say to an energy tech startup that's saying, we want to explore grant funding, where do we begin to look?
Yeah. So it can be a bit overwhelming, really. There's so many different funding opportunities these days. And it's not listed in one place. There's not like a centralized list anywhere. So it can definitely be a bit confusing about where to start. I think it's about just maybe thinking about where you would identify other kinds of opportunities. So think about the kind of the great events that you want to go to, or the kind of networks that you want to be a part of, or job opportunities, or these other things. It's about getting into those kind of networks is often where these opportunities can be shared, and that's kind of often quite a good way of hearing about the opportunities. Definitely making use of the website. So in terms of UK funding, your big one is going to be Innovate UK. So you can set up alerts for the Innovate UK competitions website, and that's the first place that you're going to hear about lots of the bigger UK opportunities. And then I think Innovate UK has a number of like business engagement initiatives like Business Connect, and those are often streamlined by particular sectors. So there will be a number for different areas. There might be something for hydrogen, for example, or innovation in wind or something like that. So getting into those kind of sub-communities can be a good way of hearing about things. On the European side, it's probably even more overwhelming. So there are some really good schemes to highlight in Europe, but they're a bit scattered all over the place. Horizon Europe is probably one that most listeners will be aware of, and the UK is now kind of fully open to access that. So that has kind of a regular release of work programs where you can kind of look through the core document and have a look at whether there are some calls which align with your area of technology. So it's just, again, kind of keeping an eye on the websites, and then at the right time, as early as possible, looking at something that's interesting for you. The general advice is definitely to look quite specifically. So, there's been a number of schemes which are like sector agnostic, which are obviously appealing for that reason, that they're very easy to hear about, and those become almost like brands in the grants world, that are kind of really easily recognizable. So those might be energy tech companies also applying alongside quantum companies, or all these different areas of technology. And of course, that means that the competition for those can become quite brutal. So I would definitely encourage listeners to kind of avoid generic sector agnostic schemes. The most famous one in the UK is the Smart Grant scheme, which doesn't exist anymore, because it just got so flooded with applications. But an area like net zero, clean energy, you've actually got quite a few more specific competitions to go after. So definitely worth that time to kind of network and research what's available, to find something a bit more specific, which will up your chances of success.
And just on a practical level, what if you were to be plopped into a startup in the role of being head of grant finding? What would you have? Would it be a spreadsheet? Would you have a list? How often are you kind of checking this? Like, functionally, just what is a good way to just keep on top? You see something pop up on LinkedIn, you go, oh, that sounds interesting. What's some tips you would give in terms of how to manage that flow?
Yeah. So what, in terms of like, what's like the recommended way, or what's the way that I see happening?
What's just some tips, whatever you think. You would suggest.
Yeah. So I think the way that it happens most of the time is it's a fairly like reactive process. So competition comes out. Oh, there's 300k we could do with some non-dilutive cash. Do we fit? Yes, let's apply for it. And then actually maybe the whole resource of the startup will then be spending a month putting together an application. Often takes, we think, around 100 hours at least, 100, 120 hours to put together something really strong. And it's going to be your founder or your most senior people putting that time in, so that it's the strongest application as possible. So that's not ideal, I suppose, having that reactive approach. And I think the risk is that you can get distracted, and you can take your eye off the ball with traction with investors or the other things that you need to do to engage with customers. So a more strategic approach is definitely recommended, where you can almost start like a spreadsheet, as you say. And what I'd recommend is beginning with a list of competitions that you found, and having a look, really going in detail over the eligibility to check that you're a good fit. Be quite risk averse. Don't try and wedge yourselves into something that's not appropriate. And once you've got a list of maybe over the last couple of years, the kinds of schemes that look interesting, you can then start to plot a bit of a timeline. And a lot of these schemes will recur over the years, so you can start to look for patterns. And that's really what we do with our clients, is we're put together a bit of a roadmap over like a 1 or 2 year period. Always going to be uncertainties, always going to be unknowns. But if you can really start to think strategically about how you can utilize funding at strategic points of time in terms of your business's growth and its strategy, that's really ideal. That's like the funding working for you, rather than kind of the other way around. So that's really the ideal to do, is try and be as strategic as possible and try and get as much information about that landscape up front, so that you can have some kind of roadmap or timeline that you can then plan for over the coming years.
Yeah, it's worth reflecting that 100 to 120 hours is a really good point, because I think a lot of startups, when we speak to them, almost see grants as a bit of free, easy money, and they're maybe overly optimistic about their opportunities to achieve it. But actually, in some cases, there's a great alignment. So it absolutely makes sense. You've got to dedicate the time and resource because it's a call for a novel type of carbon capture technology, and you're building a novel type of carbon capture technology. Fantastic. But then there's also those cases where we have seen some startups where they kind of do fudge it a little bit. They sort of force, there is a market opportunity and we're not there yet, but actually this grant's come along and we'll kind of claim to be in that space. Sometimes that can be good because it might just be bringing some things forward, but equally it might just be a fudge. So that gray line of assessing eligibility when they're sort of on the border, what are some of the factors where you would say, I think you should be leaving this one behind versus, okay, it's not 100% a fit, but it's maybe worth it? What would tip it over the balance from your point of view?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess the kind of different approaches to making that judgment, and I guess you could kind of think about it in like a kind of hard quantitative way, or you could think about it like a softer way. So, one thing in my experience is like, does this feel like a bit of a stretch?
Yeah.
Does it kind of feel easy? Does it feel like it's got momentum? Does it feel, when I read this call, am I getting excited? Is it speaking to me and what we do? Is quite a good measure,
Yeah.
that if you kind of start to like put something together and draft ideas, does it feel like you're stretching it? How does it feel? So I would start there. But what we also do is we do a scoring framework. So we have a scorecard. So we will look at what are the key criteria for a particular opportunity, and then we score. So that's a kind of a harder way of doing that same assessment. So it will really vary depending on what the opportunity is, but the typical areas which you need to keep an eye out for are kind of about technical scope, really. So okay, this call is this is about the supply chain for the automotive sector, and they're really interested in kind of technologies for reducing carbon emissions for manufacturing in the automotive supply chain, let's say. Okay, so then it's just about looking at those really specific bullet points. Do I really fit within that? That's probably the kind of the one that really takes the most thought, and where you really need to think conceptually, does it fit or not? But there are other ones, often about like the stage of the business growth. Where are you on the TRL scale? I know it's not a helpful framework for everyone, but being really honest, like where am I at on that TRL scale? Is it a fit or not? And another one that we're seeing increasingly is that we're seeing the grants now becoming much more intertwined with other funding mechanisms like investment and loans. And when you're looking at those other kinds of funding instruments or grants which play off those, there's going to be a lot of decision making around where is the business in terms of its prior investment, its ability to repay debt, etc. Which again, you really want to make sure that you're kind of being really kind of clear about where the business is in order to kind of go for those kinds of schemes. Yeah, so I'd say those kind of are the common themes about TRL, technical scope, and then about the kind of stage of the business growth.
I think that's a really important point at the end there as well, because beyond just the criteria of the competition, that financial aspect that you spoke about, and even one of the things we see often is even just the funding mechanism of the grant. So whether that is, when do you get the money? Do you have to pay it all up front and then it's 6 months down the line you get the money back? Could the startup actually handle that? Or even things like if there's a repayment, or if you have to have certain equity raises, etc., are you physically able to even if you hit every single box perfectly on the technical specification, actually maybe the grant is going to cause your business some harm? Do you see that often where people have to evaluate the functionality, the logistics of, even if we won this, could we handle it?
No, it's a really great point, and I think it comes back to what you're saying about this is free money, let's go for it. It's great if you get a grant, but as you say, yeah, absolutely, see that a lot of the time, really. when is actually the cash going to hit the bank. So okay, I've seen a competition, it's got a deadline, but then I submit an application in a couple of months' time. Okay, I need to leave a couple of months for it to be assessed. Then I need to leave a couple of months for it to be set up with the funder. Then I need to start the project, and the payments are in arrears, right? So I need to incur the cost as a business, and then only then, after about 3 months, will I get to reclaim the grant on that. So we might well be looking at 6 to 9 months from that point of time. So if you're going for quite a big grant, you putting your business in a vulnerable situation by kind of committing to that. And I think the really key point that comes back to it is about the co-funding model, right? So you get the odd grant for 100% of your costs, which is great, and that really is kind of free money, if you like. But most of the time, this will be a percentage of your costs, so typically like 70% of your costs. So a really important question to ask yourself is, where is my 30% going to come from? So if I'm going to apply for a certain amount, then I can get 70% of it covered. Where's that 30% coming from? And that's a really important question to ask yourself early on. If you're applying for quite a high amount and you don't have yet a clear plan for how you get that 30%, then really kind of maybe look at the amount that you're applying for, because that can cause quite a few difficulties further down the line and real frustrations as well. That's something that we've seen quite a lot, particularly recently, in the kind of the environment for investment. We're working with a number of businesses, actually a number of them in the clean tech space, who have got big grant wins, 700, 800k, sometimes over £1 million, which they just can't start because it's dependent upon them getting some investment in order to cover the 30%. And that's a really stressful experience and it's really frustrating, right? Because they put together a really good application and they won the funding, but they just can't access it until they get that 30%. So I think for a startup, that would almost be the first starting point to think about what is your plan for that co-funding before you start to look at how then grants can be added to that in order to expand or accelerate what you're able to do with that core 30% money.
We've seen that exactly that scenario with a couple of our startups where really amazing grant wins, but it does take that extra co-funding to unlock it, and they've been up until the deadline. We're 2 weeks away from the deadline. We need to get this funding in, and if I remember rightly, I think they did achieve it, but it's definitely that highs and lows. You've won this great grant, but then you can't unlock it as well. So maybe moving then, so let's hopefully say these hypothetical startups, they've evaluated, they've got their spreadsheets, they've looked through it all, they've evaluated a couple of grant opportunities, they realize, great, we can handle the cash, we could get the co-funding, the eligible costs match with what we expect, so that's good. So now they're thinking, right, we need to start an application. So what are some practical things they need to start thinking about? What should they be looking at in terms of the application questions? How do they go about that process of making a really good application?
Yeah, so I think it's again looking at almost like from a project management point of view, which is probably not the most exciting way to describe it, but think about, you've got R&D project as a project. It's not the business, it's a project. And then you've also got to think almost like your grant application process as a project as well. So it has an output, which is the submission. And if you think about it that way, then just think about like what's that critical part. So what are the key steps between where I am now and the submission, which are going to carry the kind of most risk and be most critical, that could really be a stumbling block. So the things not to do would be, I'm just going to kind of really write a very kind of detailed technical outline, which is kind of in my head anyway, and just start there before I do anything else. Like, what are the kind of external factors to start with? So partners, right? So you might well need a collaboration. So first thing to do would be like, have I got the necessary partners to apply for with this? And if not, then start with, establishing that partner in the research organization or the large organization that you need to work with in order to be able to submit. Sometimes, so that would be kind of the first thing to look at the partners. And then, any kind of other like dependencies which are going to be outside of your control, which you can get going with early on. I think often the thing that we find causes stress last minute will be around costs and getting those costings right. So again, start with the practicalities of the project, getting it costed out first of all, and really, the sections that you probably want to start with first are always going to be there for you later on. So those kind of technical justifications you can come on to kind of a little bit later once you've got those critical areas kind of ticked off first. Yeah.
I can know from my own experience, even just everything from job applications, the couple of things that I've always seen go wrong are, one, not just checking all the questions you're going to need to fill in. You kind of see page one and you think, okay, great, technical summary, project summary, easy peasy. Because I've been judging quite a few startup competitions recently, and it's the most frustrating where you go, really great technology, really great business, gets to the page where they're supposed to have uploaded their financial projections or they're supposed to have provided these documents, and it's completely missing because they haven't flicked through. Hopefully that doesn't happen a lot, but how do you make sure you cover all the bases and actually equally, even in a question, sometimes there'll be 4 or 5 sub questions and you've got a tiny little word count. How do you make sure it does tick all the boxes?
Yeah, exactly. That's just a really good approach. So, as you said, just start by looking at everything that you need to do, and you can't all do it at once, but just at least know that that's going to be required of you at some point. So have a review of the cool details and just list it all out on a bit of paper, right? And just know that's there. And then also, if there's like a portal, just go ahead and log into the portal and just look at where you're going to be submitting this. Have a little click around. Are there any surprises in there? That's something that we always do when we're working with a new funder. There might be a registration process. Just kind of find out all of those potential things that might cause you an issue down the line. And it's that thing, isn't it, of like, hit your stumbling block early. So just there are going to be hurdles. So just find out what those are ahead of time, so you can you've got time to kind of overcome them.
I think that project plan you spoke of is also very useful, because I've equally also experienced the frantic last minute. It's the same as university, frantic last minute applications, and then you're 10 minutes before the deadline and suddenly it doesn't work. So then also beyond the getting the application in, about who writes it. So if it's in a startup, would you recommend different people take different sections? Should there be a single author? How do you pull it all together? What's best practice in terms of, probably quite chunky grant applications? Who should be managing? How would you manage that process if lots of people contributing?
That's a really interesting question. So I think that my belief is that you want to have one voice. So when you're reading this comes from assessing these applications, right? And it sounds like you've been doing that as well. Like, I'm sure when you sit down, you've got a few of them to look through. You kind of read it at once. You've given yourself some time, and you'll read it all the way through. And it's like anything, isn't it? It's like a book or anything that you read. You'll notice patterns in what you're reading, and you will make links between bits of information that come up in one part of the application, which will then recur later in the application. And they've actually studied this, that we engage with stories and texts and narratives often by finding there's something kind of appealing about finding things repeated like little ideas coming back. And that's very, very difficult to do when you're writing with multiple people. And the best way of doing that is to have a writer who's in charge of that story. So yeah, we do a lot of work on that in terms of our approach, and we kind of really believe in that that approach of almost thinking in terms of storytelling. So one of the things that we do is we always have a very clear lead writer, and we have a storyline session, so where we just talk through together when we run our ideas past one another. And we're telling that story, and we're looking for coherence, we're looking for the steps that are being taken, and to get feedback that those steps make sense and that that's like a logical and appealing and engaging story to tell. So I think that's really important. So I would avoid divvying up an application to the extent that you lose that. However, it might not be practical to be able to write it all yourself. And also, as you say, there might be particular expertise or bits of information that, for example, like a finance lead might be better placed to answer. So yeah, have your clear sense of a lead, and then it's a case of delegating to particular people. And you might even want to like define quite clearly what you're after in a certain section before you delegate it, so that you can kind of control that kind of frame of the story that you're telling. So yeah, I would definitely say like make use of teamwork and the kind of individual skills, but you definitely want to have one person in charge who's got it figured in their head, and they're like, this is the way we're going to tell this. I'm excited by this. I'm going to communicate that to someone else who's reading it. And I think that's been my experience of how we win is getting excited about the story you're telling, being convinced that that's an important way of presenting this, and then having that sense of like ownership of being able to set that out in a coherent application. And that, I think that has to be with one person having oversight.
Yeah. And it's somewhat linked to that because you picked up on it already, was this theme of AI possibly being a co-author in some sort of sense. So it's also maybe contributing in some ways. But then equally, the other thing they might do, thinking if I was a resource-strapped startup, I would maybe have a couple of grant applications we'd done in the past. I would take them all, I'd bung them into AI, and I would say, here's this new grant application, learn from all these previous ones and copy-paste the bits that are relevant. Is that good practice, bad practice? What's your thoughts on reusing content, on using AI? How would you sort of suggest a startup handle that if that's what they're looking at doing?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really, really interesting link that you made there, Ed, because I think, I think maybe it's quite similar in a way, isn't it? It's almost like a team member, So, yeah, I think if you're kind of quite clear and structured about what you're asking of, if there's some new information that you need or a new topic that you want to research, then that I think that could be like quite a sensible use of AI. And then also, yeah, if you're drawing on a previous application, well, are there parts of this which are going to make my life easier, where I can kind of, there's some really great technical detail or some great information, but let's make sure that this new story that I'm telling is the overall one which is going to really come clearly through. So I don't want to just be rehashing stuff and it to become a bit of a confused mess. So let's pick out some key details, but let's make sure that this new story that has its clear points is the one that's being told, and it doesn't get confused in that. So yeah, I mean, I think it's just like I've heard this a lot, recently, is that actually we're realizing that, that there are some things that are really challenging to replace, right? I think one of those things is, the way that we can make sense of things and narrate things. And I think certainly, you're going to be the best place, as the founder is going to be the best person to be able to communicate that story. So don't lose sight of that or feel like you want to lose that, because that will compromise the application. Yeah.
And I think it's maybe more from my perspective, and I'm not a professional grant evaluator in all cases, so that might not apply to everyone. But you brought up storytelling quite a few times, and equally, I'm interested in that authenticity and honesty, because I think for me, if I was in this on the other side, I would prefer to read an application that's maybe honest about its challenges. It's not an overly polished sales presentation. It maybe does have moments where it says, if the question is something like, what are the technical challenges the business has been through and how they overcome, instead of going, the business has continued to succeed in all areas of, but actually go, well, in the lab in 2025, we really struggled with this, and we have brought in a new engineer, and we were able to overcome this, and use that, because again, AI didn't live it and breathe it, so it comes across more authentic. So what's your thoughts on, should startups be honest and maybe critically so, not always painting a shiny picture, versus actually, no, you do need to, this is almost a piece of sales, so don't show your flaws. Where would you sit on that sort of spectrum?
Absolutely agree with you. So it's a real strength of an application where the assessor can see challenges. That's what really gets the assessor excited, is they can see that there's an applicant who's done, who's committed to a certain topic to the extent that they've defined some challenges ahead of them, and you can understand what those are and see them clearly and understand why it's important that those could be overcome. And then you want the funding that you're going to have hopefully play a role in allocating to make a difference with, to the person writing, to be able to kind of have the resource to overcome those challenges. So when you're assessing, you kind of want to feel like there's a bit of a challenge, there's a bit of a problem, and that you can make a difference, almost enabling the company to really go for it and address it. So absolutely, that's exactly I think that's a really good starting point. Obviously, we talked a lot about some of the things to get started with, but that would probably be a really good headspace to get into when you're setting out on a grant application, is actually how can I jot down some challenges that I'm facing that are getting in the way of that bright future that I can see ahead of when this gets commercialized, and being really clear about those and writing from that space is going to be a really convincing application. And it is worth bearing in mind that you might need to kind of you might need to do a bit of a 180 from some of the other activities that you're doing at the same time. So we can always tell when sometimes they're founders, like they're raising funds, they're speaking to investors, and it's almost like a flip of the kinds of things that you want to be talking about. So with an investor, you want to make that kind of route to market fairly seamless and inevitable, and really emphasize that momentum that you've got. It's not like you don't want to write about that in a grant application, but it's, as you say, it's definitely not a sales pitch, and the assessor is going to be looking for challenges, as you said. So like time to kind of get a slightly more critical perspective on, and really bring the assessor into that story of this kind of fork in the road, which can be overcome with the help of the grant.
I like that. Almost, the grant as the hero almost of the story, so that it kind of gives them evidence of the impact of why this fundee should be awarded that grant. Is really nice. The other thing that popped into my head there when you were talking, and we brought up briefly around the collaborators. So obviously the dream is that the startup and the grant are perfectly aligned, and the project is the startup's technology. They were going to do it anyway. But often, I think anecdotally, I see from startups, maybe there's a collaboration opportunity, a field trial opportunity, a prototype version 2. So they're having to adjust things. And it's the project is kind of being crafted a little bit around the grant. It's still on the roadmap, but it's a little bit focused on the grant. How do they, because again, I think from startups, they might be nervous about overcommitting because they haven't got everything 100% planned out. If we don't get the grant, we're maybe not going to do that quite yet. So if I put absolutely everything and commit all my numbers and I commit to the partners, I'm not 100% sure it's going to happen that way. And then we win the grant and we want to change things. Is there a sense of how much detail do you go into when, you know, you're still speculative in some areas? And again, back to the honesty question, or can you be honest to say, you know, with this grant, we're hoping to achieve this, that, or the other, or should you be confident to say, this is what we will achieve, you know, when it's slightly uncertain? How do you handle uncertainty?
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's an area where I would almost say, so I think on the point about like the challenges that you face, I think that's really works in your favor to kind of ramp those up and be very clear on them. I think in terms of like what it is that you want to do and your objectives and you know the task ahead is be confident, be clear about that, and you really want to present a plan of action. So you know it might not be successful, that's fine, but if it is successful, the funder will want to know that there's going to be quite a clear allocation of where that money is actually going to go. So you do want to kind of overcome that. I mean, again, different founders, and depends on personalities and previous experience, will find this kind of easier or harder. But you do want to kind of push yourself out of that comfort zone to say, you know, let's actually think about a project. It hasn't happened yet, you know. It might not happen if the funding doesn't come in. That's fine, but let's imagine that it does, and let's put together a plan which can be as clear as possible. So I would encourage, you know, to be fairly confident with, you know, what the aims of the project are going to do, and even if there are uncertainties about the specific subcontractor that you might use for a particular task, or the particular point of time that you might reach a milestone, just go ahead with the information that you have at the moment and present that. All they're asking for is for you to present the most viable project that you can at that point of time. Present that to the assessor, and then you know you get your feedback based on what you presented. Now, if you are successful, then there's often a really good process of engagement with the funders. They're actually pretty flexible in terms of reporting, and you just need to kind of keep them up to speed in terms of what you're doing. And if you do need to make some changes, if things haven't quite gone the way that you'd planned, then you just need to report and explain that. So there is flexibility in the model. There's uncertainty inherent in R&D, which is there, so that's fine. But in terms of the plan that you have at the point of application, is present that confidently in as like a committed a way as you can.
And this might be more a question for legal, so you might not be able to answer this, but on those collaborations where there maybe is a consortium or you need to get match funding, should there be some sort of legal agreement before applying to the grant, or what would you advise in terms of what evidence is the grant funder going to want to know about that collaboration? Should there be a heads of terms or a kind of, you know, agreement of some sort? What would you expect?
Yeah, so for a kind of collaborative R&D project, there's going to be an exchange of sensitive material between different businesses and organizations, and there's also going to be commercially sensitive topic of IP about who commercially benefits and owns the kind of new knowledge or technology that gets produced. So the steps that we would usually take are support the consortium with an NDA, which is typically the first step, so everyone's comfortable sharing information within the consortium, so that just protects confidentiality. So that's usually the step that you take when you're writing the application. In the application itself, you want to outline your kind of IP strategy, and you want to flag your what's called your freedom to operate, so that you've clearly explored that you have that this is an area that can be explored, and you're not restricted by other businesses exploring in that area. You want to flag any patents that you've applied for, and as I said, outline a strategy within the project to keep going with that process of ensuring that your IP is protected. And then if you are successful, you will then have a period of time between the notification of success and then the start of the project. And that's called the project setup phase. And that's the time when you would put together what's called a collaboration agreement, which is essentially a contract between the different organizations and partners on the consortium. And the key area is the sharing of IP. So that's something that you do at that point of time. And there's a number of templates online from the UK government which have standard terms, legally drafted terms for that. So you can Google the Lambert Toolkit, and that gives a startup who maybe doesn't have access to a lawyer a standard framework that they could present to a partner and say that this is the standard government recommended terms. We've got like a choice of 8 here, and you can use there's a survey that you can complete to find which one's the most appropriate, and you can just attach that and say, look, this we think this is the most appropriate scenario. What do you think? And it's a really good starting point, which in lots of cases can mean that you don't have to use an expensive lawyer to get that collaboration agreement signed, so you can actually start the project.
Love that. Love a helpful freebie practical tip.
Yeah.
I'm sure always get legal advice, but if you can't afford it, that's always good. So then also talk to me about, you've pushed submit. So happy days, you've done your application, you've kind of worked on that, you push submit. There's then this either wait and I guess possibly the unsuccessful. So what would you recommend in terms of startups? How do they handle not just the emotional process of the wait and maybe the disappointment of not getting it, but equally the lessons and the kind of functionality of, okay, we went through this process, we didn't quite get it, just close the folder, wait to the next one? Or would you recommend that they do anything with that?
Yeah, so I think, that's a good point. So I mean, it's an emotional experience, particularly for a startup and a founder. It will be something that you're investing a lot in your own company, and then the process of writing the application as well will feel something that you're quite committed to being successful, and you can all feel, in my experience, quite strongly that should be funded. And if it doesn't, it will feel rubbish. And I think that what often will happen is it can then feel like this sense of deflation, and it can feel quite black and white. They didn't like my idea. Let's kind of put that to one side. I think if you have got a strategic approach and you've got your timeline, you've got your roadmap, you know what the success rates are like, it's a competitive landscape. I think that gives you the ability to almost look at that as material that you can then use to feed into your strategy. So, the idea of recycling is one that we've always used since all the way back to doing this in universities, and really seeing the top professors, who are the ones that bring in millions of research income every year, really noticing that the behind the scenes, the differences between the big winners are the ones that just have a slightly non-emotional approach and are actually failing a lot in the background. You don't see it, but are just regularly failing, but continue doing it. So that I found very interesting at the start of my career, to see that behind the scenes, that the winners are the ones that are just repeating. So really take on that approach. This is material. I've now got feedback on my ideas. So let's just then now fit that into the next one on the timeline roadmap. And it's fairly unusual probably to win at the first time. Very common for that to be the second or the third time. So really make use of that insight that you've gathered, and don't be too dissuaded. Really make use of that momentum that you have to think about what you can do next in terms of working up that project.
That's really good. Is it common that there's feedback given at a lot of grant applications?
Yeah, I mean, I think nearly always you should get some feedback. Obviously, the length of it and the quality of it will vary, but you should get it, and it's nearly always something that you can use and learn from. You obviously might want to give yourself a couple of days to be able to kind of appreciate that, know what it's like.
Yeah. It's difficult because I think from being on some of these judging panels, even for startup accelerators, as judges and you're writing feedback, it often comes across a lot more negative than you're imagining, because you're kind of maybe looking at criteria and saying, didn't have this, or this wasn't really as clear. And actually there's a lot of really good things, and often that doesn't come across in the application, where the judges are like, this was so interesting, really love this, because they're just quickly filling in the box to say, didn't have this, didn't have this. So
you're one of those brutal, you give brutal written feedback. You're friendly guy, seem like a nice guy in person, and then on the page you just get this kind of absolutely horrific.
Part. No, always try to put the positives in there as best you can. But I think in general, I don't know, it feels like a bit of a trend when you go into these judging rooms and actually they rip it apart. And we have to do the same on the TechX processes, that we have really fantastic judges picking who's there, but we often have to go, bear in mind the stage that they're at. We're not expecting them to have A, B, C, or D. I know they're not Facebook or Google sized businesses. So kind of tempering that expectation in the judging process. So we're almost out of time. So my last two quick questions, which will maybe put you on the spot, are just general, broadly, either being an assessor or being a grant writer. Is there any things that really make an application shine? What's your favorite application that you've ever seen, and what made them so good? Doesn't need to be one application, but from a grant writing application, if you saw these things, you'd be like, okay, these are winners for me. I really like it.
I mean, I think the bit that always gets me is like, bearing in mind, of course, like I said, start in these other areas, but the problem, I think when I read something where that's been outlined to me in a really clear way, like they've really helped me to kind of understand and kind of explained a bit about the technical area to kind of bring me up to speed when I'm reading it. So I kind of start to, there's this new area I didn't really know about this. I've learned a little bit, feel a bit more familiar with this terrain. Okay, there's something going on here. There's something that's in the way, and just kind of present that as this kind of tantalizing moment. If you can do that really clearly and in a way that that for some reason when you're reading it you really care about, I think everything will flow from there. So I think that's the bit which gets me excited when I'm writing, and then so when I'm reading or reviewing or assessing as well, is a bit is the kind of the problem. So that I think that's the key area which gets me on a successful application.
Perfect. And my final one, just off the top of your head, if you were an energy tech startup, are there any grants on the go at the moment that you've been working on with clients that you would say, have a look at this one?
So I think a really interesting area at the moment is the investor partnership scheme through Innovate UK. So that's a new initiative. Well, it's not new; it's been running for a couple of years, but it's one that Innovate UK are kind of increasingly expanding. And it's a really nice one for startups because it brings together your focus on raising equity, raising investment with the non-dilutive cash grant. So you only get the grant if you close the funding round. And the idea is that the grant will help to either accelerate or make it more likely that you close the investment round. So you have to do the two together. It's a bit logistically, you want to make sure your timings line up. But yeah, that's just reopened actually a couple of days ago. There's an early February deadline, and clean tech, clean energy, net zero is one of the key sectors which they want to support. through the scheme. So I think that's a really exciting opportunity, and I think it's a nice one as well because it'll encourage you to think about your R&D projects within the frame of your overall business growth, and that broader kind of investment journey that you're on. So bringing those two worlds together, definitely recommend the investor partnership scheme, which hopefully should be around for the next couple of years, we expect. So should be a fairly stable feature on the roadmap that we talked about putting together.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Jonathan. And I'm sure if anyone listening wants to know more about some of these grants or is looking for some support, then Ayming will be able to support you, and I'm sure you'll be able to get in touch and find out more. So thank you for listening along to another episode of EnergyTech Essentials from the Net Zero Technology Centre, where you hopefully get some practical insights into some of the key challenges facing energy tech founders and some solutions from the wonderful partners that support us through our TechX Accelerator program and help you on that journey. So pay attention for another episode coming out sometime soon. And thank you to Jonathan and the team for your continued support of the program. And we'll see everyone again sometime soon. Thank you.